Yo, the name is Alpern, and the time has finally come for another meta snapshot, following the latest release of patch 1.5 last month. Though the patch began a bit shaky, with UKF having the strongest win rates across all modes since the game's inception, the 1.5.1 hotfix tuned back some of their buffs, allowing the game to eventually settle to what I will summarize as the meta here. Now this video will most likely be outdated by April 23rd, which is the release date for patch 1.6, containing further balance adjustments as well as 2 new battle groups. Hopefully I'll have another meta snapshot out quite soon post that release. Now remember that in these snapshots I don't specify build orders, but I'll simply point at units and teching paths, as well as the battle groups that are strong enough and used often enough to justify calling them meta. Now this summary is mainly for 1v1s, as there is too many variables in team games to really give a quick summary. Now let's begin with the USF faction, which will have very minor changes since the previous snapshot. Now the most dramatic change is the nerf for armored fast deploy ability, which was moved to 1 CP. That makes the 4x4 Jeep a lot slower to hit the field and has thus resulted in a massive reduction in the double Jeep opener. And most Jeep play across the board has toned down. With that said, the Jeep has actually seen a bit of a resurgence in just the last few days, but with a pretty different change of playstyle, where instead of going for the territory capture with the armored Vet 1, you go for the enhanced repairs, which for some reason can be used while in combat and while moving. It is a bit cheesy, however I'd say this Jeep play is still so rare that it's far from meta. Armored and airborne still remains by far the most commonly seen battle groups, with mostly the same builds as before, so I'll just reference the last snapshot for the meta for USF. Moving on to Wehrmacht, which, while it had some nerfs to the coastal reserves composition, has really seen little to no major changes when it comes to how people play this faction. Breakthrough still sees the occasional use with MP40 Grenadiers, but coastal reserves mostly remains the meta pick, with the same units as in February. Now, while USF and Wehrmacht has seen barely any major changes, the other two factions has seen some rather substantial change when it comes to meta with this patch. And starting with UKF, the call-in nerfs to both air and sea as well as armored, coupled with the change for the training center, has heavily popularized Indian artillery. This is due to how UKF's now generally weaker early game without infantry training can be flipped into a huge advantage, utilizing the cheaper Polston upgrade for the truck that comes with the heavy mortar call-in. The heavy mortar call-in can be on the field quite consistently before the 4-minute mark, which makes up for a lot of the otherwise quite weak early game. Getting the training center upgrades is still very common, though they hit later, with infantry training, support weapon training and armor training all being very common. Now, since Indian doesn't have any tank call-ins, the game plan for UKF mostly consists of stalling with 6-pounders and Gurkhas before dominating with Matildas and Grants. And these units are so strong that I'd say UKF is one of, if not the strongest late game faction currently in the game. This is partially also due to how UKF now regularly sees tier 3, means they can use the refit ability, allowing them to refit units that either get phased out, such as the light vehicles, such as the Polston, but also how they, for instance, can call in another mortar and refit it, thus getting a massive cost reduction. Or they can call in a 17-pounder and refit the truck that way, or they can go for a fast Crusader before refitting the Crusader from Matilda. That ability just allows the faction to be so versatile in the late game. With this said, the other two battle groups for UKF still sees the occasional play, but they mostly get picked facing off against DAC, as the call-ins allows UKF to not get overwhelmed by light vehicles before hitting that late game. But I would still say Indian is by far the meta pick. Finally, moving over to DAC, which also had some quite impactful balance changes, with heavy nerfs for both the L6 Colin as well as the Caro Armata, has flipped the meta pick to armored support. This has less to do with any meaningful changes to armored and more so to do with the justified nerfs to the overperforming Collins, which has been overshadowing this battle group for quite some time. Now the unit roster that sees play for DAC still remains mostly the same, with the major early changes being heavy use of the bike, before getting P-Jaegers versus light vehicles or Assault Grenadiers versus infantry, depending on what you're in need of. This is then eventually followed up by teching tier 2 as fast as possible and massing 8-rads with the superior fire drills from the battle group, turning the 8-rads into cocaine rads. The occasional Flame Panzer III sees play versus builds relying on handheld AT, as it's quite tanky and has great synergy with cocaine rads, where the fire damage deals health damage, while the 8-rads finishes off the models. The late game composition then mostly relies on critical mass of these tier 2 vehicles, such as cocaine rads, marders and the occasional Stug D, as well as eventually the command P4 call-in. Many different armory upgrades sees play here, which is of course dependent on not only the game but also player preference. However, I would claim only really the smoke canisters remain the meta upgrade, as that upgrade basically sees play every single DAC match. And that's a quick summary of my perception of the meta. Very little changes for USF and Ver, while DAC and Brits has completely flipped around. Now for more specific builds, I do recommend checking out Cohdb, where you can see the specific builds players use by clicking on an uploaded replay. Patch 1.6 is coming up soon with the new battle groups for UKF and DAC, which I am sure will shake up the meta quite a bit, so be on the lookout for that. In the meantime, thank you for watching.